Are there people that are genetically have genetically low ApoB, and if so, what's their cardiovascular mortality, their all-cause mortality?
Yeah, so there are people. So it turns out ApoB and LDL-C are highly genetic, which is what has allowed us to do the Mendelian randomization studies that act as one of the, there are basically three cornerstones of data that make it unambiguously clear of the relationship between LDL or ApoB and ASCVD. So you have all of the epidemiologic data, which again, epidemiology is rife with problems. But when the data is pretty much all in the same direction, and you have the dose effect and all these other things, it becomes quite helpful. You have all the clinical trial data, which I would divide into primary and secondary prevention data. And then you have the Mendelian randomization data, which again, for listeners, is basically anytime there is a biologic variable of interest that is under a high degree of genetic control and produces a high degree of variability in the population, you can look at how nature has basically randomized it across people, and you can look at outcomes of interest. So in the case of LDL-C, because we know it is highly genetic, right? This is clear in that, and I don't just mean in extreme cases, but just across a population, you can see that lower lifelong exposure to ApoB or LDL produces lower ASCVD risk over a lifetime. So using this, we can say there are people at really low and high extreme. So at the high extreme, you have the people who have what's called familial hypercholesterolemia, which is a genetically heterogeneous disease, meaning there are literally thousands of mutations that result in a similar phenotype. The phenotype is defined as having an LDL cholesterol off medication of more than 190 milligrams per deciliter, and there's a couple of other criteria, but just to give you a sense of how high the LDL needs to be to meet that criteria. At the other end of the spectrum, we have these people with very, very low LDL-C or ApoB, and the most interesting group of these are the people who are folks that have a hypofunctioning gene for PCSK9. So Helen Hobbs made this discovery in probably the early 2000s. My vague recollection, I remember reading this paper when it came out. It was a really mind-boggling paper. Call it like somewhere 2004, 2005, 2006, somewhere in that neighborhood, which is, hey, there are these people walking around with LDL-C of like 10 to 20 milligrams per deciliter. And these are adults, right? So normally we just never see that in adults. And they weren't doing anything different, right? They just, like they weren't on some crazy diet or clearly weren't taking any medication. And these people were found to have a mutation in their PCSK9 gene that rendered a hypofunctioning protein. And PCSK9 is a protein that degrades LDL receptors. Now, another subset of these people, their mirror opposites, were discovered several years earlier, which had a hyperfunctioning PCSK9 gene, or a gene that produced a hyperfunctioning protein. And these people had sky-high LDL cholesterol. They were a subset of the familial hypercholesterolemia syndromes. And these people weren't. And what was interesting to note is that they just didn't develop cardiovascular disease. So I can't tell you what their life expectancy is because I haven't looked at those data. But what I did confirm is they have no increase in the incidence of any other disease. So in other words, they're absent ASCVD, but they don't make up for it with more cancer or more neurodegenerative disease or more diabetes.
That's interesting for a couple of reasons. One, you see on Twitter a lot, the very, very, just the hyper-focused, very low-carb community that's like, they share studies about, low cholesterol. People with low cholesterol have a higher all-cause mortality. They're more likely to die from, all these different causes of death.
Yeah, the problem with those studies is, I'll only address this once because I've done so much addressing this that